Another interesting principle that was brought up in this week's reading, in chapter 4, was violence that happens against nonviolent movements, and kind of that dichotomy, that I guess that feeling that there's an imbalance of power because there's one regime or one structure that has been committing violence for generations, and there is the other who, pardon my friend here, this is so embarrassing, but then there's the other group that doesn't have any access to committing that same level of violence, but also they have this moral authority kind of blocking them from reaching that level of violence because, well, if you're willing to commit the same crimes that your oppressor did, how does that make you better than them? You know, so there's so many different I guess concepts, principles that come into play with all of that. And as I was reading it, it's so crazy that even when facing insurmountable odds, actually, because people face insurmountable odds and incredible violence and cruelty, they're inspired to make change. I think that says a lot about the human spirit at its core, its ability not only to stand up for itself, but to bounce back time and time again. As we talked about before, how, say for example, African Americans in the United States had tried and tried before with civil resistance movements, but it wasn't really until Rosa Parks that somehow just set off this catalyst of events and all of these great changes. And the same thing happens here. And so we see in the reading that there's always the risk of violence outside of the movement. We can't force someone else to de-weaponize, but that there is power in words and in meaningful action. For example, there's ways to boycott certain products or certain services, but then again, that brings us back to the question of, well, is that causing financial violence? Is financial violence a thing? Is it not? It certainly could be seen as less harmful than direct violence, but boycotting is an effective way to move a regime, to harm it in a way that that kind of debases them to a certain level and gets them to change, as opposed to forcing walls to break down. But I think the biggest concept was that there's always going to be a risk. There's always a gamble. It's kind of like in Dangerous Love, it talks about how when you turn, there's always the risk that the other person isn't going to. And it's the same here, even though it's less turning and more of just having a conversation. Just because you open your mouth doesn't mean that the enemy will, but there's a chance, and that a lot of times it's well worth the risk. So